Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is clear that if the resurrection didn't happen, we worship in vain. But why is the resurrection the linchpin, and can it be defended? Welcome to the Unapologetic show, where we defend truth without compromise with Dr. Bobby Conway, the One Minute Apologist. I'm your host, Tim Hall. If you are a thinking Christian who is interested in studying and defending the Christian faith, you are in the right place, and we would invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also, if you want more resources such as this one to continue, please consider joining our support team at oneminuteapologist.com and then clicking on Donate. Well, Bobby, lots of stones have been thrown at the resurrection in an attempt to knock it down. So what might be, that might be because it is kind of a central claim of that, but why is the resurrection such a central claim to Christianity?
When you consider Paul in his magnum opus on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, he really leveled straight with us the ramifications of whether or not Christianity is true hinges on whether or not Jesus rose from the grave.
Yeah.
He said, if Christ has not risen, then your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. So basically, if Jesus has not been risen from the grave, then the gospel is emptied of its power, that he and all the others are mere charlatans, that we have been duped, and we might as well just pack up our suitcases and go eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting in that, just that you were referencing there in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, I delivered to you of first importance what I also received. So even he, right off the get-go in this chapter, is just putting that central, the first importance. And then he goes on to say what those are, that Christ died in according with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So right there, Paul's testifying to the importance of this event. Is the Bible historically valid, or is that a good place to go to kind of answer some of these questions? So why should we look at the Bible, or how can we consider it to be reliable at all?
We have an abundance of manuscripts. If you take the Old Testament and New Testament combined, you have 4.5 miles high stacked of manuscripts, compared with 4 feet of all the ancient day manuscripts that we can pull together, like the Mahabharata and some of this stuff. So we have an amazing amount of material at our fingertips that we have accessible to us. And I would say that, number one, some of these books are written by eyewitnesses of Jesus, or associates of these eyewitnesses, like Luke or Mark, right? Mark was a disciple of Peter. Luke was a disciple of Paul. So you have, eyewitnesses, or you have people who associated with these eyewitnesses, and that's incredible. But then you think about like the first centuries and the patristic fathers and the apologists.
Right.
I mean, you can think about people like Josephus in his history of the Jews. I mean, he records what Christians believed about Jesus, that he died, was buried, and rose again.
Yeah.
So you don't have to just look strictly at the Bible if that's the concern.
Yeah. Well, and even in that verse that we were quoting about the importance of the resurrection is an early creed that would go back before kind of the written documents, if you will, when it was kind of, codified into books. And it's one of those, 1 Corinthians in general is one of those books that, by other historians is attributed to Paul. It's not kind of on the outside. So if you're having a conversation with someone and they're saying, I don't really think the Bible is reliable at all in history, you can say, okay, well, we could get rid of a lot of the other texts in the Bible, but we're going to kind of rest on this early creedal saying in 1 Corinthians 15, which is pretty solid. So I think that's really important.
This little traditional piece that you see there in 1 Corinthians, this little creedal that some thought would be like a hymn that would be sung. You have James Dunn. You have other noteworthy scholars who will date that to just a few years after the resurrection of Christ. Now, think about the New Testament. Probably Galatians is the first book written in the New Testament, probably around AD 49.
Yeah.
So if this little fragment that Paul refers to is, being passed around at just a few years after, depending upon how you date Jesus at his birth will determine how you date his death and resurrection. But let's just say 80-30 if you have a dating of this document, and then compare that with Galatians. This is almost 2 decades before we even have the first letter of the New Testament written. So we've got some good stuff that we can look at to help us to feel good about the validity of the resurrection.
Yeah, so we're kind of building now. So we've defended that the resurrection is this linchpin, this key moment, this key component of Christianity. But now, what kind of evidence would you give, other than maybe what we've said already, that would point to it being a reliable conclusion within reality? That's one of the things that's different about Christianity, is that its claims are rooted in history. So what other evidence would you point to specifically that would affirm the resurrection?
Let's take the disciples of Jesus. They could hardly follow him during his earthly ministry. Even Peter, think about this. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times. He says, no way, I would never deny you. Just a few hours later, that prophecy of Jesus was fulfilled. Now, you think about James, the half-brother of Jesus. Becomes convinced by his brother who rises from the grave, writes the book of James. We think about Peter and his transformation, writing 1st and 2nd Peter. Paul writing 13 books of the New Testament.
Right.
It is astonishing. I think that the life change that you see is credible evidence for the resurrection. That would be one point. A second evidence that I think lends credibility to the resurrection is the fact that if you were trying to fabricate a gospel about Jesus, you wouldn't have women showing up as the first eyewitnesses, because that would maybe not be considered trustworthy or reliable evidence. What does Jesus do? He shows the value of women, and he appears to them, and they become the first witnesses of his resurrection. And so, in other words, if you were making this story up, you wouldn't have women given the way that they were perceived in the Greco-Roman world as the first eyewitnesses. So they weren't worried about the embarrassment factor. They were worried about telling the truth. So we're saying that the life changed, the before and after. We're saying that women being the first eyewitnesses. I think the emergence of the local church is another slam dunk. Like, you cannot explain the emergence of the local church apart from the resurrection of Christ. And so that goes to really establish something powerful. I think another line of evidence is his body was never discovered. And so that's huge, right? Why wasn't his body discovered? If the skeptics stole the body of Jesus, then when the disciples are saying he rose from the grave, they would have brought his body out and said, look, here it is.
Right.
But they didn't. Where did his body go? Well, we believe that he rose from the grave. Yeah. And I would say, finally, if I was just to add one more point, it's the multiple confirmations that we see. He appeared on several different occasions, appearing at one time to over 500 witnesses. And Paul reminds his audience in Corinth of many of which are still alive. In other words, if you don't believe my testimony, some of the people who saw Christ can verify what I'm saying.
Yeah, go and check them out. I think those are all really great, and we'll kind of talk about maybe some possible objections to some of those here in a few minutes. But the next thing that I wanted to ask you was, when looking at the Bible, some people will say that it's a theological book and it's not meant to report history at all. And so there's this use of telescoping, which Michael Ancona talks about, particularly in the book of John. There's lots of allegory that's happening. There's biblical kind of archetypes where they're pulling kind of stories from the Old Testament and kind of reinterpreting or re-understanding them in the New Testament. And so how then do we need to separate the theology from the history, or do those get intermingled, or kind of what's going on with the theology and history side of things? Bart Ehrman himself will say, historians aren't, they can never conclude God.
Historians can't presuppose belief in God. Historians can only work with what we've got here among us.
how would we differentiate the history from the theology there?
If God becomes flesh, then he's going to live in history. He's going to live in a particular context.
Right.
He's going to be born in a particular context. And what's amazing about the Bible is the Bible talked about, Micah 5:2, that he would be born in Bethlehem, of the line of the tribe of Judah. And so it gives it that he would fulfill the Davidic covenant. So there's so much about Christ that we are aware of. And the Bible was giving us that the Messiah is going to come, and he's going to come into a context. So just because this Messiah does miracles and things that we're not used to doesn't mean that we get the right then to say, you know what, we're going to shave off all the supernatural, and then we're just going to say that history is natural. Right. History has some supernatural features throughout that you can see clearly in the Bible. Now, miracles aren't on every page of the Bible.
Right.
They're actually far and few between when you consider the amount of miracles in the Bible as a whole. You basically have miracles taking place like with Elijah and Elisha during the time of the prophets, with Moses and the giving of the law, then with Jesus, and then the apostles, and then again in the eschaton. And miracles are acts of God to confirm the messengers of God. And so all of these miracles that are being done are situated in a historical context.
Okay.
So we can't say that these miracles, for example, that Elijah is doing or Elisha's doing or Moses is doing or the apostles are doing, we can't trust the history because miracles are happening there.
Right.
Maybe we should trust the history more because miracles are happening because it's clear evidence that God is showing up in the midst of that history.
Yeah.
The Bible is dealing with real places and real land and real bodies of water. And the Bible knows that Egypt, is to the south, and that Babylon is to the north, and that Assyria is to the north. It is aware of its context, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it seems like what you're saying is that the historian who limits himself to a methodological naturalism, viewpoint when studying history is kind of missing some of the insight into the Bible. Yeah.
And methodological naturalism, for maybe our listeners, it's a fancy way of saying that we have a method of coming to truth claims on naturalism alone. In other words, the universe is zipped up and they don't leave room for a divine foot to enter our realm, so to speak, as it's been said. So it's basically close-minded because they zip the universe up.
Yeah.
And this is what I think makes Christianity we're more open-minded.
Right,
like we don't zip the universe up. We're willing to follow where the evidence leads, even if it means that there's things called miracles that we don't see every day. We're willing to believe because we don't operate from methodological naturalism.
So we want to turn to maybe some possible objections here. We've talked about kind of those early facts, and we've talked about the conversion of Paul and the starting of the church and how that needs an explanation. But there's been lots of things that have kind of been lobbed at this, again, from a skeptical standpoint. So one of the major objections is given this time frame that we talked about where, you said that Galatians was the first book that was kind of maybe written down that Paul penned. There was still a time frame, a period between when the resurrection was said to have happened and when the New Testament was starting to be written down. And that time frame is said is like, legendary things can start to kind of come up. The stories will start to evolve and they'll be embellished on over time. And so that 30 years is more than enough time for these legendary accounts to come up. So how do we address this idea of it's really just legend?
Well, a lot of times people will say, and I've heard this said at different times, and I've said it before, that 2 generations is not enough for legend to emerge. I don't think that that's quite good enough because, we eyewitnessed on the news 9/11, and we've seen different conspiracy theories that have been mentioned.
Yeah.
So I don't think it requires a great deal of time for myths to arise. I mean, think about the news. I mean, every day, you can turn from conservative to liberal news, and they'll get you can hear two different viewpoints on every piece of news practically. So it shouldn't surprise us that there's different interpretations on what happened to Jesus. The thing that makes me most convinced, though, is when I consider what happened to his eyewitnesses. I mean, listen, if he didn't rise from the grave, why in the world would they go die for their Savior?
Right.
Some would say, oh, well, we shouldn't look at the evidence of the Bible. Well, okay, so we want later evidence? Okay, that's fine. Let's look at Polycarp. Polycarp was mentored by John.
Yeah.
John was on the island of Patmos. Polycarp, he would inform us on the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus as well.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I don't think that it's surprising to me that these myths around Jesus not rising from the dead have emerged. I just think that we look at the evidence. So we shouldn't have to say, oh, two generations is not enough, like I've said before. I think it'd say, well, it seems like it could be, even if it is, let's just say it is enough.
Right.
Let's say it's plenty of time. Well, then which story best fits the facts that we have? And I think that the story that best fits the facts is the one that we have a resurrected Messiah whose followers were willing to go die for him and spill their blood for the sake of the local church being spread throughout the world.
Yeah. How much influence do you think the Jewish culture that Christianity arose out of when it comes to storytelling, relaying information, kind of the scribes writing stuff down accurately? I mean, we have a history of, you've mentioned it before, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know that the Jewish community accurately recorded and accurately copied the stories that they were told and kind of were passed down. This is the context in which Christianity is kind of arising. So does it make sense to then lump on, now legends, can happen in these 20 to 30 years when there's this long history, thousands of years of, keeping the legendary accounts at bay with accurately recorded and written text, transmission over time within the community. How much do you think that plays into this, defeating the legendary narrative that could come up?
Well, I mean, you take, for example, a legend emerged immediately that the body was stolen. So that's like the thing. It's like that was, there's all kinds of like explanations people try to give to explain away the resurrection. They were hallucinating. His body was stolen. I mean, that's in the New Testament. That emerged very quickly. Yeah. So I think that what we look at then is we go, well, how do you best answer such a skepticism? The body was stolen. Okay. Right. Well, if the disciples stole the body, then why would they steal the body and then go claim that he rose from the grave and then go die for him?
Die for it, right?
Well, and someone say, they felt guilty for denying him, so that's probably why. I just don't think that's strong enough.
Right.
Like if he's not truly the Son of God, then why are you going to give your life in this way? They believe something happened. Or if the skeptics stole the body when the disciples were saying he rose, then they would have brought the body out. So that's the kind of discussion points. These different types of topics emerge. Now, there are 2nd and 3rd century ideas about Jesus, like in the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Bartholomew. These different Gospels. These are late Gospels. The disciples that they're saying attributed to, they had already long died.
Yeah.
So I think as we consider the stories that emerge, we just try to look at what best fits the evidence. And as I just shared, I think that's a way to do that. Okay, so in true 1 Minute Apologist fashion, how would you answer the objection of, they were just hallucinating, all the accounts of post-mortem appearances of Jesus were all just hallucinations? Yeah. Well, I can say I've taken a lot of LSD in my pre-Jesus days, and I've sat around with my buddies in rooms while we all fried on acid, and none of us came out with the same trip. And so I would say 500 people aren't seeing the same thing at once. This is just begging to get rid of the resurrection from history, but we'll never be able to do it. Well, amen to that. Well, we hope this is a helpful resource for you as you're having conversations, maybe particularly during the Easter season, about the resurrection of Jesus, and that if you were doubting or having some questions about how can I trust the scriptures, or is the resurrection really a linchpin or central to Christianity, we hope we helped answer that, and we hope to meet you next time on the Unapologetic Show.